So the students occupied the computer center with some white students on the left, etc., at the beginning, because they believed it was the nerve center of the university, which was a huge joke. Because in 1969, the only thing that went through that computer center were some research projects of faculty members in engineering, etc., and the payroll of the university. But it wasn't anything like today, where you had email and all the rest. That stuff didn't exist. It wasn't the nerve center of anything that couldn't be done elsewhere. So they occupied it, and the dean of students, Magnus Flynn, immediately wanted to call the police and get them to evict the students. They had no right to be there. And idiots like me said, this is not Berkeley, we don't do that. Let's reason with them. Let's negotiate with them. Let's talk to them. Don't call the police, because we don't want to be like the University of California, Berkeley, where they were breaking the heads of students, etc. That was the biggest mistake I ever made. They should have been evicted. They thought they would be evicted. They wanted to be evicted. That would have fulfilled Stokely Carmichael's injunction that they do something. And if they'd been let off in paddy wagons and booked and then released, which is what would have happened, they would have been happy. And idiots like me said, oh no, let it wait, let's talk to them. Well, talking to them got absolutely nowhere, and instead dropout students from all over Canada came to Montreal and joined them in the computer center. Nothing was done to blockade the computer center, right? Finally, they issued a series of ultimata and demands because they realized they were losing the semester. Their grades were shot. They were getting screwed in their minds because we were waiting them out, although we didn't mean to. We thought they'd see reason and all this. Meantime, the investigating committee was hearing testimony, etc. They went through 5 lawyers that the university hired for them. As each lawyer heard their evidence, he or she resigned because there was no case. So who were these students? Roosevelt Douglas was a political science student at McGill University. When I came to Montreal in 1964 as a young assistant professor to teach the history of Africa, Rosie enrolled in my class. And he was in my class for about 2 or 3 weeks. And then he resigned from the course in the history of Africa. Why did he resign? I interviewed him about that. He said, I took your course on the history of Africa because I wanted to learn what it felt like to be a slave in the hold of a slave ship on his way to a plantation in the Caribbean. He came from Dominica, one of the small islands, where his father was a senior politician. I said, Rosie, the aim of this course is not to help you put yourself in the shoes of a slave on his way to the Caribbean. It's to teach you about the history of the ancient kingdoms of Africa. It's to teach you that Africa had a history. It's to teach you about the difference between domestic slavery in Africa and plantation slavery in the Caribbean. It's to teach you about the effects of the slave trade on Africa. It's to teach you about the coming of colonial rulers and their usurpation of authority over Africans. It's to teach you about colonialism and imperialism. It's to teach you about the fight for independence. It's not to teach you how to feel like a slave. He said, well, that's why I took your course, and that's why I'm not taking it anymore. So that was my introduction to Rosie. This was before the 69 events, right? Kennedy Fredericks. Kennedy was another West Indian student. And he unfortunately wound up in a mental asylum in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. He was extremely emotional. I'm not suggesting he acted as he did because he was crazy, but he was somebody who clearly was very sensitive and struggling to maintain his balance. Okay, and maybe he would have succeeded if it hadn't been for these events. Some of the other students who were involved were not Caribbean and were not from the But let me say about Rosie and Kennedy Fredericks. We hosted here in Montreal, and I was on the committee that worked on it, the annual conference of the United States African Studies Association in the fall of 1968, maybe, or 69. And black students came from Cornell University, black militant students, and they disrupted those meetings. They said the association was racist. It was a joke. I mean, the association existed to ensure that universities taught the history of Africa, etc. But at Cornell, where African history wasn't being taught, I think, in those years, etc., they were doing a black power ritual because they had very few African Americans on the faculty. And here were these bright young African Americans who were trying to say, make place for us in the university, we have arrived. So they disrupted Cornell. Then they came to Montreal and they disrupted the U.S. African Studies Association. And with them came, or in that same time period, Stokely Carmichael, the author of the book Black Power. Stokely was invited to give a lecture in in the hall building across the street, H110. And Stokely demanded all the white students leave the lecture hall. I only want to speak to black students, he said. That happened. The white students actually left. And he then gave the students who remained, the black students, a lecture on black power. And he had heard that there were these charges that had been made of racism, but what were the students at Concordia or Sir George doing to see that those charges were answered? And he said, you have to occupy, you have to be militant. So this, I think, was one of the origins of the occupation. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying, quote, outside agitators, unquote, created the Computer Center occupation. What I'm saying is he pointed them in a certain direction. And he did a real guilt trip on them, okay? And he said, you have to act on behalf of the brother. They had to be rescued by the firemen and the police, who, in the meantime, they opened the windows and started throwing computer terminals and cards from professors and students' research projects out the window, so you got the pictures of the falling computer cards, the IBM cards, as we used to call them. And some students standing downstairs may well have chanted, "Let the niggers burn." I never heard it, but it could have happened. There are idiots all over the place. We had friends at other universities who knew nothing except what they read in the newspapers. The newspaper and radio and television accounts were largely wrong, which didn't surprise me as a historian, but for other people it was a real education. We had a reporter at the Gazette by the name of Philip Winslow, I think, who was a draft evader from the Vietnam War, who immediately identified with the African American students, and wrote these terrible articles that were so skewed and so off and so factually wrong. But that was what the Gazette was putting out. We had good articles, rarely, from people who still work for the CBC, etc. Time Magazine had one of the best articles. Want to see a good article? Look at Time Magazine's coverage. It was good. They got the facts, they checked them, and they really did a good job. And that was the last place we ever expected to find good journalism in those days, in Time Magazine.